Yesterday, United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer stood in front of the House Ways and Means Committee and delivered an ultimatum under oath that fundamentally altered the terms of North American commerce. He stated that Washington is at the end of its rope regarding Canada's provincial trade policies, threatening an imminent enforcement action over an ongoing retail boycott of American wine and spirits. That specific declaration transforms a long-standing cross-border friction into the most severe institutional crisis between the two neighbors since the 1980s. The escalation did not emerge from a vacuum, but rather follows a strict multi-month timeline of economic retaliation. In February 2025, the White House initiated this trade cycle by imposing a blanket 25% tariff on the majority of Canadian industrial goods, alongside a 10% levy on energy exports and targeted 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Canadian provinces reacted immediately, with Ontario and Quebec ordering government-run liquor boards to remove all American beer, wine, and spirits from their retail shelves. This retaliatory mechanism struck a critical artery for U.S. commercial agriculture, as Ontario's Liquor Control Board operates as the single largest individual purchaser of beverage alcohol on the planet, leaving an estimated $80 million in American products immobilized in provincial warehouses. The strategic friction intensified when Greer explicitly paired Canada with the People's Republic of China, identifying them as the only two nations currently executing active economic retaliation against the United States. That deliberate sequencing in testimony does not merely address a commercial dispute over luxury agricultural goods. It places a G7 ally and America's largest export market into the same strategic category as its primary geopolitical competitor. By framing Ottawa's trade model as fundamentally incompatible with current American economic architecture, Washington is signal-boosting a policy shift from standard regulatory management to an outright defensive stance. What that choice reveals is an administrative effort to prepare the domestic political landscape for a much broader structural separation during the upcoming trade agreement review, the rationale driving Canada's refusal to dismantle its retail barrier is anchored entirely in an unprecedented contraction within its industrial heartland. Over the past 12 months, the Canadian manufacturing sector shed exactly 51,800 production jobs, representing the sharpest employment decline of any domestic economic sector. The core of this industrial erosion remains concentrated in Ontario, where integrated automotive supply chains and primary metal processing plants are highly exposed to the U.S. tariff regime. Data from the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario projects that these trade barriers will result in a net loss of 119,200 manufacturing jobs across the province by the end of 2026, causing provincial manufacturing GDP to contract by 8% relative to baseline forecasts. Those metrics translate directly to severe reductions in factory output, including a projected 22% drop in motor vehicle parts manufacturing and an 18% decline in primary metal fabrication. That concrete industrial damage explains why provincial leadership across Canada has rejected Washington's demands for a unilateral removal of the alcohol boycott. Ontario Premier Doug Ford confirmed that retail access for American brands will remain entirely frozen until Washington offers verifiable, reciprocal rollbacks on the industrial tariffs, depressing Canadian employment. This gridlock underscores a fundamental misalignment in negotiating frameworks. Washington views the provincial alcohol ban as an illegitimate barrier that must be cleared before broader trade talks can commence, while Ottawa categorizes the retail ban as a direct symptom of the original American tariffs. By treating the initial tariff wall as a non-negotiable baseline, the United States has inadvertently forced the Canadian federal government to accelerate alternative economic strategies. In response to this pressure, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has pivotally shifted the country's macroeconomic strategy away from traditional continental reliance and toward aggressive global diversification. Over a 6-month period, Ottawa executed 12 bilateral economic and security agreements spanning 4 continents, designed specifically to dilute Canada's structural exposure to the American market. This diversification strategy materialized concretely in January 2026, when Carney conducted an official diplomatic visit to Beijing, the first by a Canadian head of government in 9 years, securing an agreement that lowered Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola to 15% while completely removing levies on major maritime exports until the conclusion of the year. In exchange, Canada permitted the entry of 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%, deliberately defying an explicit White House threat to impose a 100% border penalty on Canadian transit sectors if the deal proceeded. This decoupling from Washington's economic preferences is being framed in leadership not as a temporary tactical maneuver, but as a permanent structural redirection of the state's economic gravity. In a public address, Carney explicitly stated that the United States has fundamentally shifted its approach to global trade by raising border duties to levels unseen since the Great Depression, meaning that Canada's historic reliance on the American market has converted from a strategic asset into a systemic vulnerability. This perspective matches his earlier declarations at the World Economic Forum, where he warned that middle powers must organize collective economic frameworks to avoid systemic marginalization by larger protectionist states. The subsequent cancellation of Canada's invitation to Washington's international security forums confirms that the White House recognizes this rhetoric as a deliberate pivot away from the traditional North American economic perimeter. But the capacity of both capitals to resolve this impasse is severely constrained by competing geopolitical priorities that diverge significantly from the bilateral trade agenda. Internal reporting indicates that active negotiations on the comprehensive review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement have effectively stalled due to Washington's singular operational focus on the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. This shift in administrative bandwidth has sidelined key architects of the continental trade system, leaving the enforcement of border policy primarily in the hands of regulatory officials like Greer, who operate on highly rigid statutory mandates. Consequently, the bilateral trade relationship is currently functioning without a high-level political safety valve, allowing technical enforcement dates to approach without the diplomatic flexibility required to broker a grand bargain. That structural drift carries a hard operational expiration date of July 1st, the official deadline that triggers the formal, mandatory joint review of the trilateral North American trade framework. If the current standoff persists past this threshold without an established negotiating framework, the resulting regulatory uncertainty will begin compounding across deeply integrated supply chains that handle over $1.8 trillion in annual commerce. Manufacturing logistics, cross-border corporate investment strategies, and long-term hiring commitments are entirely dependent on predictable, tariff-free passage through continental corridors. By allowing a dispute over $80 million in warehoused retail spirits to block resolution on a multi-billion-dollar industrial tariff regime, both governments are signaling to global markets that political sovereignty and ideological alignment now supersede 30 years of physical economic integration. But the more consequential question, the one that industrial logistics planners and sovereign wealth funds are monitoring with intense strategic scrutiny, is whether this current deadlock represents a temporary diplomatic failure or the permanent unwinding of the integrated North American economic zone. The tactical gridlock detailed over the preceding analysis carries structural implications that extend far beyond a cross-border retail dispute or localized manufacturing contractions. What this systematic deterioration reveals is a fundamental realignment in how middle powers and hyperpuissances interact within a fragmented global trading architecture. The escalation between Washington and Ottawa is not an isolated policy failure, but rather a deliberate stress test of two incompatible economic doctrines operating under a hard chronological constraint. As the July 1st contractual review window approaches, the behavioral patterns established by both administrations outline the emergence of a highly transactional, compartmentalized international order for Canada. the immediate strategic trajectory requires a permanent acceptance of structural economic friction with its largest trading partner. The calculated diversification framework enacted by Ottawa, characterized by 12 new international agreements across 4 continents, confirms that the state is actively underwriting short-term domestic disruptions to secure long-term strategic autonomy. By lowering barriers on 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles and re-engaging with Asia-Pacific agricultural consumers, Canada is attempting to reduce its historic reliance on a single market that has demonstrated a willingness to weaponize asymmetric access. This reorientation forces a rapid reorganization of Canada's domestic industrial base, shifting capital and state support away from trade-exposed manufacturing sectors towards specialized resource extraction, critical mineral processing, and continental energy provision. For the United States, the strategic shift demonstrates an administrative commitment to institutionalizing protectionist measures as permanent fixtures of national security policy. By maintaining a comprehensive tariff wall against a highly integrated G7 ally, Washington is signaling that reducing trade deficits and reshoring industrial capacity take absolute precedence over preserving decades-old bilateral frameworks. The deliberate placing of Canada into the same regulatory category as systemic adversaries confirms that the current American administration views non-conforming economic models as structural vulnerabilities rather than standard market variations. This stance implies that future American trade diplomacy will rely strictly on unilateral pressure, requiring partners to provide upfront concessions simply to maintain institutional access to the domestic market. This continental friction sends a highly clear signal to external economic heavyweights, specifically the European Union and India, regarding the baseline mechanics of the changing global order. For Europe, which relies heavily on predictable multilateral frameworks to manage its trade dependencies, the absolute breakdown of the continental free trade norm between Canada and the United States confirms that defensive economic blocs are becoming mandatory for survival. The emerging model suggests that Brussels must accelerate its own autonomous supply chain architecture and prepare for a trading environment where standard security partnership no longer guarantee commercial immunity. For India, a rising economic center operating on a doctrine of strategic multi-alignment, this dispute validates a policy of maintaining diversified, highly transactional trade networks rather than locking its industrial base into rigid, single-axis regional agreements. The likely next moves from both continental capitals will focus on standardizing these parallel strategies before the regulatory deadline arrives. Washington will continue executing its targeted approach, finalizing separate bilateral terms with more compliant regional partners like Mexico, while keeping Canada's formal negotiating track isolated. Simultaneously, the United States Trade Representative will likely initiate formal enforcement proceedings under existing compliance mechanisms to penalize the provincial liquor boards, using targeted retail restrictions to maximize political pressure on local industrial centers. Ottawa will respond not by dismantling its retail defenses, but by leveraging its status as a critical energy and resource supplier to create selective, sector-specific proposals designed to appeal directly to American industrial consumers. This continuous cycle of action and reaction reveals that the true point of contention is not the accumulation of specific trade metrics, but the structural preservation of state sovereignty in a post-globalized world. The evidence demonstrates that the era of uninhibited continental integration has reached its logical conclusion, replaced by a system where trade is treated strictly as an extension of geopolitical power. When a major industrial state explicitly frames its closest neighbor's economic philosophy as a fundamental incompatibility, the underlying dispute is no longer an issue of regulatory calibration. It is a declaration that the fundamental rules governing international commerce have changed, and that institutional predictability has been permanently replaced by calculated economic leverage. Ultimately, the single most important takeaway from this structural transformation is that the separation between national security and economic policy has completely vanished. the traditional assumption that deeply integrated supply chains and shared democratic values would naturally prevent aggressive trade warfare has been thoroughly disproven by the hard math of 30,000 lost manufacturing shifts and billions in frozen commercial assets. Moving forward, the status of a nation as a security ally will offer zero protection against the enforcement of protective border barriers if its domestic economic model conflicts with the strategic priorities of a dominant global consumer. The standoff between Washington and Ottawa is the definitive baseline for a new era. An era where economic interdependence is no longer viewed as a bridge for international cooperation, but as a primary vector for geopolitical coercion.